There is a new ambient occlusion feature in the Wicked engine called Vertex Ambient Occlusion, Vertex AO for short. What this does is to bake ambient occlusion effect into vertices. Let's check out how that works. So I opened the Stanford Dragon sample model here. As you can see, the lighting on it is pretty flat. There is only ambient lighting in the scene coming from the sky. To bake Vertex Ambient Occlusion into this model, simply select it, open the object panel, to the bottom of it. You will find the Compute Vertex AO button. Just press it, the baking will start, and it will take some time. How long it takes depends on how many polygons you have in your model. This is because it goes over every polygon and does some raycasting to check blocking light. And since it's done on the CPU, it will take some noticeable amount of time. It will look up the editor for a bit, which is not ideal. I will want to improve this with a loading bar at some point, but right now it will be just looking it up and you will have to wait until you get back control. Anyway, since the baking is done now, you see the changes immediately. There are some dark spots on this dragon where the light is having a bit of a difficulty to reach into, like the mouth and some crevices on the model. Since this is baked statically into the model, the performance impact will be minimal on this. This is the most lightweight ambient occlusion technique right now in Wicked Engine. You might have noticed that since this is a Vertex AO technique, since this is baked into the vertices, it's kind of strange that it is not in the mesh properties where the vertex buffers are. But this is because this effect supports instancing, so you can have different vertex ambient occlusion for different objects that use the same mesh. I will demonstrate that simply by duplicating the dragon model. As you can see, the vertex ambient occlusion is duplicated on it, so both models are using the same ambient occlusion. But I will select one of the dragons now and rebake the ambient occlusion on it. By the way, since the ambient occlusion is currently baked, the button changes to delete Vertex AO. So if you press it, it will delete it, and then you can compute it again. Let's compute it. The baking is done, and now you see the dragon models are using a slightly different ambient occlusion. The one I baked second has its one side it's darker than the other because the other dragon was blocking the light when the ambient occlusion was baked on it, and the first dragon was baked as if nothing is nearby it. Anyway, let's put down a few spheres to demonstrate the effect a bit better. I will put down one sphere and duplicate it so it uses instancing and the same mesh across all the spheres. So let's scale them a bit to demonstrate that different scaling is supported and such. Like this. If you want to bake the ambient occlusion onto everything, simply select everything with Ctrl A and then press Compute Vertex AO. The Vertex AO baking has completed. Let's check out how it looks. As you can see, all the different objects have different ambient occlusion to them. If you grab one object and move it, you will see that the ambient occlusion is not changing on it. Everything is completely static. The parts that are intersecting are completely black if only ambient light is present in the scene. Once you put down a direct light, like a point light for example, ambient occlusion will not block direct light since that's not the purpose of it. As you can see, direct light completely illuminates ambient occlusion regions as well. The ambient occlusion lighting quality will completely depend on how many polygons you have on your model. If you press Ctrl W, you can see that these models are highly tessellated. So the ambient occlusion lighting quality is quite good on them. If you go back to the ambient occlusion settings, you can also find the ray count and ray length sliders. The ray count is directly related to the quality of the ambient occlusion. With fewer rays, the baking will be faster. With more rays, it will be slower, but the quality will be better. The ray length modifies each individual ray's length, which is shot from vertices. So if you have a room that is really occluded, like really dark, then you can reduce the ray length, for example, to only have the ambient occlusion constrained to corners of the room, for example. You can also bake ambient occlusion into dynamic, skinned or animated models. Let's check out how that works. I opened this Viroid model, which is, as you can see, animated. It has some idle animation. Even though it's animated, the ambient occlusion will be static on it, and it will be baked on the mesh's default unanimated pose, which is a T pose in the case of this mesh. Anyway, just select it, and you can just simply compute the vertex ambient occlusion on it as for a regular mesh. It's complete. Since this is a textured mesh, maybe the effect is not that apparent on it. To better check the ambient occlusion effect, you can disable textures simply by going to the general options and pressing disable albedo maps, which will let you visualize the ambient occlusion on this model. If you want to check how it looks without ambient occlusion, you can also select material and disable Vertex AO in it, and then simply check the effect before and after. You can also see some specular lighting on this model right now, and you can disable that you can disable that with the force diffuse lighting button. This will let you visualize the ambient occlusion even better. Anyway, since the ambient occlusion was baked in the T pose, the default pose of this model, not the skin model, you cannot see any ambient occlusion, for example, in this area where you would expect it, near the arms and the body, because the arms are actually extended sideways when the ambient occlusion is baked. Since this is a completely static AO effect, I think this is acceptable. So I recommend you to use this Vertex ambient occlusion technique if you like the look of it on all your high poly assets. I do not recommend to use the Vertex AO on really low poly things, like, for example, if I put down a quad in the scene or a plane. As you can see, it's really low polygon. It only has like 6 vertices, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. With 6 vertices, it really can't do a proper interpolation of vertex ambient occlusion across the vertices. So at worst case, it might be completely without ambient occlusion or completely with ambient occlusion and interpolated incorrectly. Let's check that out. If I place this right here and bake the ambient occlusion on it, then you don't see anything happening because all the vertices are completely unblocked from the light. If I put this here, so for example, one of the corners is completely blocked by light by putting it inside the character, then as you can see, this vertex gets fully ambient occluded value, and it is interpolated quite inefficiently across the whole quad. So for this reason, I recommend to use it on your high poly meshes. I hope you found this video interesting and you will find the Vertex AO ambient occlusion effect useful for your projects.